Today's text comes from the Acts of the Apostle, chapter 8, verses 26 through 31. In your pew Bible, it is on page 892. Acts chapter 8, verses 26 through 31. Then the angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south, to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road." So he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, the queen of Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home. Seated in his chariot, he was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah and asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" He replied, "How can I unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. The word of the Lord. Before we get to this text, there's a lot that has happened, a lot that has changed. The early church was going through a difficult moment, and yet this is the moment when the church was truly becoming the church. In the chapter prior, you had the apostle Stephen, who was held before the court and was telling the history of Israel, and said how wonderful the history was, but now the time had come and the Messiah was here, and they stoned him. And in the story of Acts, there appeared suddenly a man who was and is to become very important and a vital part of the story of the church. It says that Paul was there and Saul. His name was Saul before it became Paul. Saul was there and approved of the stoning of Stephen, and the church was dispersed because a persecution had opened up. So here we are at the very beginnings of the church, the very beginnings of Jesus' movement after Jesus. See, we see the Gospels and we see the movement and Jesus speaking and all that was happening, but normally, Jesus wasn't the first one to be proclaimed Messiah, and especially during this time. And whenever something would happen or someone would rise that they would call Messiah, what would happen is that when the person died, just give it a little bit and the movement died off as well. But this Jesus guy was different. Here we saw all that he did and what he had spoken and how he had blessed and healed, and then he died. But then he didn't stay dead. And the people who believed in him saw him. And the people who were around him saw him, and others saw him as well. And this Jesus who had died and whose movement should have died with him was alive once again and taken up into heaven, where many saw him leave, as we saw in the beginning of Acts of the Apostles. And in chapter 2, it tells us that Jesus had said, "Don't leave Jerusalem until the Spirit has descended." That's where we get the day of Pentecost, when 120 people are gathered in a room praying and supplicating and presenting all of these things before God, when suddenly the Spirit came down and they started to speak in different languages, and it grew from 120 that were sitting in that room to over 3,000 in that day. When God starts to do something, something happens. And so here in Acts, we see the beginnings of this church. We see the beginnings of what's going on. We see the beginnings of how God is moving. And as we come through the chapters and we get to chapter 8, something begins to change, because up until that moment, everything that had happened, everything that had been spoken, all of the healing that had been done, the 5,000 that were fed, the Spirit descending, it had all happened to those who were Jewish first. The first church was a Jewish Christian sect. They weren't the church as we know it today. They weren't a separate religion. They didn't believe outside of Judaism. They were Jewish first. And they happened to believe that Jesus was the Messiah that was to come. So it's a little different from our church today. And I specify this because as we start to move through Acts and start to see the movement of the Spirit, we get to this time of persecution where the church had mainly been in Jerusalem. Now everyone is dispersed and they leave Jerusalem. So this time of people being captured, imprisoned, and killed, and others fleeing from Jerusalem, this is the moment when the church was supposed to die. The movement was supposed to end. We weren't supposed to be here 2,000 years later. But a curious thing happened. Those who fled from Jerusalem, they didn't flee in fear and quietness. They fled from death and fled from imprisonment, but they started to share the good news as they went. They didn't flee into quiet caves and stay there until the storm had blown over. Instead, they went out and started to talk about Jesus. And it started with the Samaritans, who were cousins to the Jewish faith. So they were fairly Jewish in their way of belief. So it went from a Jewish community to an almost Jewish community or Jewish family community. And then we get to the story of our text today. Because here we have a person who is an outsider for the Jewish faith. An Ethiopian eunuch who is important in more ways than I think we can imagine here today. First off, because he was a eunuch, he could not ever be fully Jewish. He could come and maybe stay on the outside, on the outskirts of the temple, and be able to listen and to believe in God. But he would be more of just a God-fearer. He will never be able to be a Jewish believer. Normally, there was a process of baptism and circumcision and all these things that you had to do, these rites that had to be done, and you would be brought into the family and be adopted into a Jewish community. Here we have someone who can never be that. But yet, there's something about this Jewish God that fascinates him. There's something about God that brings him all the way from Ethiopia. And thinking in a first century mind, Ethiopia and Nubia was thought of as the ends of the earth. No, there was no world beyond Ethiopia. There was no world beyond Nubia. Now we know that it's just south of the Sudan and there's plenty of Africa left. But at that moment, the ends of the earth was represented by Ethiopia. And here we have this man, a believer who can never be part of the community, a man of importance that came all the way to Jerusalem just to be close to the temple of this God that he is fascinated by. And it is in the midst of this. Maybe he wasn't welcome in the temple, but he went anyway. Maybe he could never be a part of this God's family, but he wanted to grow as close as he could. And so as he's returning home, God calls him. God sends Philip on this road, on this desert road that people rarely were on. And there Philip hears that the eunuch is reading Isaiah 53. And Philip calls to him and says, "Do you understand?" And he says, "How can I understand unless someone teach me?" This is the first example, the first story, the first person who is not Jewish or Jewish related that hears the gospel, that receives the gospel message, that takes the good news with him. And the amazing thing is that the first person that the New Testament tells us about that wasn't Jewish or Jewish related at all is a black man. How amazing is that? The first person to receive the gospel outside of the Jewish faith was a black man from Ethiopia. And stories have it that he was the first evangelist to Ethiopia and outside of the region who went farther than just the local region. He took the gospel message all the way to Ethiopia, and there they became a thriving church. But how amazing is that? The first person to receive the gospel in a non-Jewish way was a black man from Africa. A person who was rejected by Jewish custom and rite. An outsider who could never be part of the Jewish faith. He's the first person that God extends grace, mercy, and love to. How amazing is that? And here we have Philip, who is one of the people who come in after the apostles. They're almost like the second generation of apostles, along with Stephen and others, who were brought in to help with the community as it grew, to help feed them, to help supply, to help administer, to be ministers of administration. And it is this Philip that God calls to be on the road, to see this black man, to give him the good news and provide him with baptism into this new way. How good is God? It also speaks to us about Philip, a person who maybe others look down upon because he wasn't as important as the apostles. He didn't sit with Jesus and he didn't do all the things that they did, as much as they did, I should say. But yet, he is the first person to share the good news with a person outside of the Jewish faith that leads to the Christianization of the world. How amazing is that? So we walk this journey together. He went out and shared the good news. And so how does that reflect on us today? How does that speak to us today? We live in a world that's non-Jewish. We come to a church that's non-Jewish. We are a Christian church outside of our Jewish roots. It was the first century that created the church that we have today, but the church that is today does not represent the first century church. And so how do we reflect upon this text today? I think it helps us to realize that wherever we go and whatever we do, it's always the right time to share the good news. Whatever we are doing, wherever we are going, it is always the right time to share the good news. But now I have to ask you, have you received the good news yourself? It's easy to say you go to church. Many of us go to church. We know the rituals. We do. But how many of us live the gospel message? How many of us have received the gospel message enough to be able to say we truly live the gospel message? I pray each day. I read each day. I follow. It's not just about being a good person. It's about being intentional. In the early Exodus, there was a fire that was lit on the altar in the Holy of Holies. And it was required that this fire stay lit always, that the fire never be allowed to go out, but that it always stay on. And so how is it that they could keep the fire going without ever letting it go out? You have to feed the fire. You have to put wood on the fire. You have to put things on the fire to keep it going. And so the Spirit and our belief and the gospel and God within ourselves today functions in very much the same way. Our relationship with God functions just as relationships with others function. If you don't put wood on the fire, if you don't bring the fire together, if you don't feed it oxygen, if you don't put things to allow it to continue to burn, what happens? It fades to embers, and at some point will turn off completely. Is your relationship with God in embers at this time? Is your relationship and belief system and theology, is your heart struggling at this moment in time? Because what was once a roaring fire has burned down to embers. And you're afraid that it's going to turn off. The gospel message is the good news that God provides us with the strength to put more on that fire. God provides us with the ability to grow in relationship with Him. God helps us to make it through these dark moments of embers and allow us to have a roaring fire once again, but we need to put the work in as well. It doesn't just happen. The angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Go to this road." If Philip decides not to go, what happens? The Spirit of the Lord guides the people to where they need to go, but if they decide to stay, what happens? If the Israelites in Egypt never leave Egypt when they had the opportunity, what happens? Whatever fire existed burns out to embers and turns off. So I encourage you today, while you still have embers, because you can make a new fire from the embers of old. You can light new wood with embers that are still glowing red. A new flame can be lit from the flame that was, but unless you do it, it won't happen. Unless you put in the effort, it won't happen. If you allow it to burn out, if you allow it to die, it will be a lot harder to get it started again. So I call to you, as the embers are still burning, as the possibilities are still there, I call to you and say it's time to do the work. It's time to take out a few minutes to pray each day. It's time to maybe read Scripture just a little bit. It's time to listen to God. It's time to talk about the one who has saved you. It's time to share the good news that has been stored away in your heart and in your mind for so long. I call to you to keep your fire lit, to listen to the Lord, to be guided by what God has called you to do, and to go and do. Maybe you'll be called to a desert road one day, and when you get there, you'll run into an unexpected person. And your words of encouragement to that person can not only change the course of that person's life, but change the course of so many others who were blessed because of what you did on that day, in that moment. So it's time to respond to God. It's time to say yes. It's time to keep that fire lit, or to reignite that fire. So I call to you, to each of you, to respond to God's call with yes. I want to keep this fire lit. Help me to light this fire, reignite this fire, keep this fire going within so that I can share what you have done with me.